Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
Good morning and welcome to today's episode. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and each day I invite you to join me as we reflect on a significant moment from our shared past. Today is November 25th, and we're looking back 242 years to November 25th, 1783. On that gray November morning, the last British troops marched down to the docks of Lower Manhattan and boarded ships for England. The occupation that had lasted 7 years was over. A few hours later, General George Washington rode triumphantly into the city he had been forced to abandon in 1776, entering through streets lined with cheering citizens. The Revolutionary War had officially ended. The British were leaving. America was truly independent. But this wasn't the celebratory moment of pure joy that you might imagine. The evacuation was messy, painful, and complicated. Thousands of Loyalists, Americans who had sided with Britain, were fleeing their own country, unsure if they'd ever return. The city Washington reclaimed was battered, burned, and divided. And ahead lay the enormous challenge of transforming 13 fractious colonies into a functioning nation. November 25th marked an ending, yes, but also a beginning, and the transition between war and peace proved almost as difficult as the war itself. The story of Evacuation Day, as it came to be called, offers lessons about how wars end, how occupations conclude, and how victors and vanquished must somehow find a way forward together. To understand what it meant for the British to leave New York, you need to understand why they had held it so long and so fiercely. New York was the strategic prize of the Revolutionary War. It had the finest natural harbor on the eastern seaboard. It sat at the mouth of the Hudson River, which provided access deep into the continent. Control New York, and you could split New England from the southern colonies, cutting American communications and movement in half. The British recognized this immediately. In August 1776, General William Howe landed on Long Island with the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent overseas, over 30,000 troops. Washington, with a smaller, less experienced army, tried to defend New York, but was comprehensively outmaneuvered. The Battle of Long Island was a disaster for the Americans. Washington barely escaped across the East River with his army intact. He retreated through Manhattan, through White Plains, across New Jersey, and finally across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. New York fell to the British in September 1776, and they would hold it for the next 7 years. It became the headquarters of British military operations in North America, a major naval base, and a haven for Loyalists from across the colonies who fled there for British protection. At its peak, the British garrison in New York included over 30,000 troops, the largest concentration of British military power in North America. The city suffered terribly under occupation. A massive fire in September 1776, just days after the British took control, destroyed nearly a quarter of the city's buildings. Whether set by American saboteurs or started accidentally remains debated, but it left thousands homeless. Another fire in 1778 destroyed more structures. By war's end, New York was a shadow of its pre-war self. Buildings ruined, streets damaged, infrastructure collapsed. Yet it remained vital to Britain throughout the war. Even after Yorktown, in October 1781, When Cornwallis surrendered and the war's outcome became inevitable, Britain held New York. Peace negotiations dragged on for 2 years. The Treaty of Paris wasn't signed until September 1783. Only then did Britain agree to evacuate New York, and even then, the logistics took time to arrange. The British evacuation wasn't just a military withdrawal, it was a refugee crisis. Tens of thousands of Loyalists had fled to British-held New York during the war. Some were wealthy merchants and officials whose livelihoods depended on British connection. Others were ordinary people who believed the revolution was treasonous, rebellion, or who had personally benefited from British rule. Many had fought for the crown. All knew they might face persecution if they stayed. The Treaty of Paris stipulated that no further persecution should occur and that Loyalists should be allowed to recover confiscated property. But this was honored more in the breach than the observance. State governments confiscated Loyalist estates. Communities ostracized or drove out those who had sided with Britain. Loyalists had good reason to fear remaining in the new United States. Britain promised to evacuate any Loyalist who wanted to leave. Between April and November 1783, over 29,000 Loyalists departed New York for Canada, the Caribbean, or England. They took what possessions they could carry. Many left behind property, businesses, and homes they would never see again. Families were divided, some members choosing exile, others staying and hoping for eventual reconciliation. The most poignant evacuees were the formerly enslaved people who had fled to British lines during the war, responding to British promises of freedom. About 3,000 black Loyalists departed New York for Nova Scotia, seeking the liberty the American Revolution had not granted them. Their departure reminded everyone that freedom in the new United States remained limited and conditional. The evacuation was chaotic. Ships were scarce. Departures were delayed. Loyalists and British soldiers competed for space. Some people waiting to leave lived in tent cities or in the ruins of burned buildings. Prices for everything skyrocketed. Tensions were high, violence occasionally broke out, and the whole affair took far longer than planned. For those leaving, it was heartbreaking. These were Americans, born in America, forced to flee America because they had chosen the losing side in a civil war, which is what the Revolution had been in many ways. Their exile was America's first great political migration, a reminder that independence came at a human cost beyond battlefield casualties. While the British prepared to leave, Washington waited with his army just north of the city. The wait was frustrating. The British kept delaying, citing logistical problems, weather, and the need to evacuate more Loyalists. Washington suspected they were stalling, reluctant to surrender such a strategic prize. Finally, on November 25th, the last British troops marched to the docks, boarded ships, and sailed away. As they left, American forces moved in. Washington, accompanied by Governor George Clinton and their respective staffs, rode into the city. The entry was triumphant but restrained. Washington was never one for ostentatious display. He rode through streets lined with cheering crowds, past buildings still showing war damage, past vacant lots where structures had burned. It was victory, yes, but over a ruined city that would take years to rebuild. The symbolism was powerful. 7 years earlier, Washington had fled this city in defeat, his army beaten, his reputation as a commander in doubt. Now he returned victorious, the war won, independence secured. He had outlasted the British through determination, resilience, and a refusal to give up even when defeat seemed certain. The triumphant entry into New York was vindication. Yet Washington's thoughts may have been bittersweet. He had won the war, but lost 8 years of his life, years he would have preferred to spend at Mount Vernon. He had seen thousands of men die. He had witnessed the country torn apart, and he knew that winning independence was just the beginning. The real work, building a stable government, uniting the states, creating a functioning nation, lay ahead. 8 days after entering New York, Washington would gather his officers at Fraunces Tavern for an emotional farewell before resigning his commission and returning to civilian life. That resignation, voluntarily surrendering power when he could have kept it, would prove as crucial as any battle he won. The British departure resolved the military question, but left enormous political and social challenges. What to do about the Loyalists who remained? Some Americans wanted revenge, confiscation of property, denial of political rights, even exile or imprisonment. Others, including Washington, argued for reconciliation. The country needed healing, not continued division. Punishing everyone who had sided with Britain would create permanent enemies and waste human capital the new nation needed. The debate over how to treat former enemies after civil conflict remains relevant today. Too much vengeance prevents reconciliation and creates lasting bitterness. Too much leniency may seem unjust to those who suffered and fought. Finding the balance is never easy. New York faced practical challenges too. The city's infrastructure was devastated. Commerce had collapsed. Many buildings were unusable. The population was a fraction of pre-war levels. Rebuilding would require massive investment and years of effort. The immediate post-war period was economically difficult, with depression and hardship widespread. Politically, the states were barely united. The Articles of Confederation created a weak central government with almost no power. States acted independently, sometimes at cross purposes. There was no effective way to raise revenue, regulate commerce, or conduct foreign policy. Within a few years, it would become clear that the Articles weren't working, leading to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So while November 25th, 1783 marked the end of British occupation, it marked the beginning of a different struggle. Making independence work, transforming military victory into political stability, building something enduring from the chaos of revolution. The British evacuation of New York illustrates patterns that appear when wars end, especially protracted conflicts that divide societies. First, endings are slow and messy. The decisive battle at Yorktown was in October 1781. The peace treaty was signed in September 1783. The evacuation wasn't complete until November 1783. That's over 2 years from military victory to actual conclusion. Wars don't end cleanly on specific dates. They trail off gradually, with negotiations, evacuations, and adjustments taking months or years. Second, endings require dealing with those who collaborated with or supported the other side. Every war produces people who sided with the losing party for reasons of conviction, self-interest, or circumstance. What happens to them? The Loyalist exodus from New York shows one solution. They leave, sometimes by the tens of thousands, becoming refugees. But this is costly. The country loses their skills, talents, and economic contributions. Alternatively, societies can attempt reconciliation, allowing former enemies to reintegrate. Both approaches have costs. Third, victory doesn't mean prosperity. Despite winning independence, America faced economic depression in the 1780s. New York, despite liberation, faced years of rebuilding. Military victory doesn't automatically translate into political stability or economic success. Sometimes the post-war period is harder than the war itself. Fourth, occupied territories suffer lasting damage. New York was occupied for 7 years. Buildings were destroyed, infrastructure degraded, social fabric torn. Liberation is joyous, but the occupied city Washington reclaimed was diminished. Occupations leave scars that take generations to heal. Finally, wars create refugees and forced migrations. The Loyalist exodus was America's first major political refugee crisis, but far from its last. Every major conflict creates populations displaced by violence, persecution, or simply being on the wrong side. How societies handle these migrations shapes their character. On this November 25th, 242 years after the British left New York, the patterns from Evacuation Day echo in our own time. We've seen occupations end, the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan, countless others. Each follows similar patterns: messy logistics, protection of collaborators, debates about who can stay safely, infrastructure damage, and long transitions from war to peace. The challenge of reconciliation after civil conflict remains urgent. How do societies heal after being torn apart? South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the rebuilding of Rwanda after genocide, the reconstruction of Iraq after sectarian conflict, all face the question that confronted America in 1783. How to deal with those who are on the other side: punishment or forgiveness, justice or reconciliation? The answers are never simple. Refugee crises continue. The Loyalist exodus from New York in 1783 was approximately 29,000 people, enormous for its time, but dwarfed by modern refugee flows. Syria, Ukraine, Afghanistan, South Sudan. Conflicts create millions of displaced people seeking safety, just as Loyalists sought safety in Canada or Britain. The challenge of absorbing, resettling, or reintegrating refugees remains as difficult as ever. The economic challenges of post-war reconstruction remain enormous. Rebuilding cities, restarting commerce, creating stability, these tasks consumed years after the Revolutionary War, and they consume years after every major conflict. The Marshall Plan's reconstruction of Europe, the rebuilding of Iraq and Afghanistan, the reconstruction of Syria or Yemen, all face challenges that Washington's generation would recognize, and the challenge of turning military victory into political success remains daunting. America won independence in 1783, but took years to create a stable government. Many countries have won military victories or achieved independence only to descend into instability, dictatorship, or renewed conflict. Victory is just the beginning. Perhaps the most profound lesson of Evacuation Day is how fragile victory can be and how much work remains after the shooting stops. Washington entered New York in triumph, but within a few years, America would face economic crisis, political gridlock, and serious questions about whether the Union could hold together. The Revolutionary War had been won, but the American experiment was far from secure. This reminds us that winning a war and winning the peace are different challenges requiring different skills. Military genius doesn't guarantee political wisdom. Battlefield success doesn't ensure stable government. The hard work of building institutions, establishing legitimacy, creating economic opportunity, and forging national unity often proves harder than the fighting itself. Yet America did manage that transition eventually. The Constitution replaced the Articles of Confederation. The economy recovered. New York rebuilt and eventually became the nation's largest city. The Union held together, survived a civil war, and endured. But none of that was inevitable. It required work, compromise, vision, and luck. Evacuation Day marked an ending and a beginning. The war was over, but building the nation had just started. Washington entered New York victorious, but understood that the greater challenges lay ahead. He was right, and his recognition of that, his humility in victory, his understanding that independence was opportunity, not achievement, may have been as important as anything he did on the battlefield. Thank you for joining me today on the Daily History Chronicle. As philosopher George Santayana reminds us, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Today we saw how the British evacuation of New York marked both an ending and a beginning, teaching us that wars end slowly and messily, that victory creates challenges as complex as the conflict itself, and that how we treat former enemies, rebuild damaged cities, and handle those displaced by conflict matters as much as how we fight. Washington entered New York triumphant, but understood the real work, building a stable nation, was just beginning, a reminder that winning the peace is often harder than winning the war. Until tomorrow, may your day be enriched by the lessons of history.